This book right here is my most favorite book that I have read. So, glare from the light. It's an old book. Let's see what the copyright is. The copyright is 1979. So it's a real old book, but it's so good. So I'm going to read it. It's by Amanda Hart Douglas, and it is a historical fiction book. So I'm going to read the prologue. Okay. Prologue, 1692, Port Royal, Jamaica. Port Royal, Jamaica was not so much a town as a bawdy house for pirates, profiteers, and whores. They were a motley lot, and their unholy antics caused the town to be called the wickedest city in the world. The buccaneers were essentially hard-faced men who made out well in an undeclared war between England and France. The buccaneers formed the Brethren of the Coast, which for 30 years built the Spanish possessions as well as every coin they could carry. Embarrassed by the actions of the buccaneers, England occasionally arrested a pirate or two, hung them, and left them to rot in public as examples. But this did little to deter those who remained. Their lifestyle was too firmly entrenched and glorifying pirated gold and the joys of truant morals. Sitting on an expansive veranda of Dead Chest, a drinking establishment, was Jeremy Whitcomb, an English pirate and the unquestioned ruler of Port Royal. To his cohorts, he was Jeremy the Gent. It was a false title and a mocking one, for the gentleman in question was not a gentleman at all, but a round pudding of a man with an unruly black beard, untidy habits, and, so it was said, a streak of cruelty. So, colorfully dressed in a flowing shirt of pink silk, green, and white striped breeches, and an ill-fitting wig, greasy and unkempt, Jeremy the Gent toyed with his cutlass and surveyed the preparations for the hanging. Sodden with rum, he was anxious for the proceedings to get started. He himself should have been headed for the gallows, along with the two who were condemned. But Jeremy bargained with the lieutenant governor of Jamaica, who was a dishonest man. After a heavy payment of gold exchanged hands, Jeremy was judged innocent of all wrongdoing. Still, he was not in an uncomfortable position. He was not in a comfortable position. I was wondering, like, that's not grammatically. Anyways, lieutenant governors were changed more quickly than money changed hands, and Jeremy the Gent knew it all too well. "What's holding up the hanging?" he bellowed. His voice was as hoarse as rough nankeen. I don't know what a nankeen is, but they do have a small glossary in the front that I'll go over a little bit later. Several of the men who worked as pirates on Jeremy's ship, Red Shark, cowered in their chairs. He's in an ill temper, whispered one toothless old man. "That he is," replied another, "and it could just as easily have been old Jeremy swinging today." The man speaking was young, but his face was scarred from a run-in with the tip of a cutlass, and weathered from the rough weather of high seas. Weather means it was basically beaten, and weather meaning what's happening outside. Is it raining? Is it snowing? Is it sunlight? So it's kind of a bad sentence here because they used a homonym. Anyways, and I'll tell you what, matey, I for one wish it was. The two glanced uneasily at Jeremy and then to the harbor itself, where Jeremy's great 3-decked vessel sat attended by none except for 3 cabin boys. "He'll be wanting to pull out tonight," reasoned the toothless man. "Aye," agreed his companion. "After paying off the lieutenant governor, he'll be wanting some fresh plunder." A native whore, dressed in homespun calico and decorated with bangles, sashayed out onto the veranda. Her name was Tuli. She was Jeremy's special woman. She carried a pewter mug filled with rum in her left hand and a palmetto fan in her right. She set the mug of rum down on the table in front of the ferocious pirate. He looked at her without affection. "De porkers done?" she asked in a voice sweet with an island lilt. I don't have an island lilt, so I'll try my best. Ha! She glanced at, no, sorry. No. Okay. "De porkers done?" is where I left off. She asked with the very voice sweet with the island lilt. She was a pretty girl, not yet 16, possessing full, voluptuous lips. You know what? The lips that everybody wants today. High cheekbones, like mine, and slanted eyes with heavy lids. "De porkers done?" she asked anxiously. "You think she hungry?" The pirate slapped her on the rear and laughed. "So it's pork you're wanting, is it? I'll give you some pork." Ha! He's so dirty. She glanced at Jeremy out of the corner of her slanted eyes. Her glance was filled with a sharp and well-honed hate. You think she liked him? One of the other pirates spoke up. "Ain't no eating till after the hanging," he said, exposing the few teeth he had left in his mouth. The girl shrugged her shoulders and walked back into the cool darkness of the bar room. She sat down at the table and drained the remains of a forgotten drink. Now, we all know that you don't forget your drink in a bar, okay? Because that's just not good. She clutched her hand to her breast and gasped for air. She felt like crying, but she did not. A dog, driven by the scent of the cooking meat, walked directly through the square, salivating heavily, looking neither to the right nor the left. The 2 boys, turning the spit, saw the dog approaching and smiled. Jeremy also saw the mongrel. "Now, what's that dog think he's up to?" the pirate snarled. He pushed himself up from the chair, grabbed his cutlass, and walked slowly towards the hungry beast. The dog had gone to the very edge of the pit. So totally involved with the odor of the cooking pork was the dog, it didn't notice the pirate's approach. Jeremy grinned, raised his cutlass with the one quick movement, and beheaded the dog. The boys at the spit jumped back in horror, letting go of the handle. The dog's head flopped to the ground. Its body stood firmly planted in the dust, shaking a few moments before falling onto its side. Suddenly the ground trembled and Jeremy was nearly thrown off balance. He caught his footing and looked about, frowning. He half expected to see a prankster slinking off behind a juniper tree. A swarm of doves that had been resting on the eaves of the stucco buildings flew and disappeared into the cloud-laden skies. The inhabitants of Port Royal stopped, frozen on their tracks, waiting for the next earth tremor. But the sky became calm in the earth, and the earth stilled. They laughed nervously at one another's apprehensions, fornicating and fulfilling their senses to the utmost. The prison was a small one-story building made of rough stone. It was located at the far end of the main street in Port Royal on a hillside, all but hidden by the thicket of logwood trees and clumps of tall fern-like plants, locally called shame ladies. What? Really? Shame ladies? Besides the alcoholic but trustworthy jailer, a native named John Crow, who lived on the premises, the only inhabitants of the small prison were two young pirates who had been arrested by the English authorities and were sentenced to be hanged that very day. As a prelude to the feast in the square. These people are animals. The older pirate name was Captain Andrew Sheffield. He was an imposing looking man, nearly 6 feet tall and heavily muscled. He possessed a rough but handsome face, bright red hair, and a great flowing red beard. Both were the color of the sailor's sunset. This unusual color made him be called flambe by all. Sharing the same cell was a younger man named Benjamin Wyatt. He had long blonde hair that was slightly wavy and sun-streaked. He was slenderer than Sheffield, but nearly the same height. His face was poetically handsome, with dark brooding eyes, a straight aquiline nose, and sensuous lips that made him always look slightly out of place on the pirate ship. He was a handsome man. The curve of his lips and the twinkle in his eye told the world that Ben was definitely a ladies' man. But on that day, there was no twinkle in Benjamin Wyatt's eyes, for he and Sheffield were less than an hour away from being hanged. The two felt that the earth tremor had been greater on the mountainside than in the main part of Port Royal. It caused the dust on the prison floor to rise and choke them, leaving in its wake a small separation between several of the stones that held them prisoner. Ben stood on a narrow bed constructed of rough planks, staring through the open bars of the window. "They're going to have some celebration on us," said Ben scornfully. I can see that fat pig Jeremy from here. I'd like to see him roasting on the spit." He outsmarted us, my lad. But then he's got away with them. Sheffield pantomimed coins falling from a purse into his hand. "Yes, he outfoxed us all right, and we'll be sorrier for it." The brass bell in the tower of the city's tallest building began to toll. It was a low, mournful sound and sent shivers through Sheffield and Ben. "That's it, Captain," muttered Ben. "The 12 o'clock bell. They'll be coming for us." The older man clutched the younger one's hand, seeking comfort from one who had never quite been his friend. "It's been good knowing you, Ben." I doubt that we'll even be meeting in any cloud-filled paradise. You're a good man, and he grinned. An even better pirate. Thank you, Captain. I wish to hell we were dying in battle on board ship, not here upon this cursed land. Cursed land. Suddenly the ground gave a mighty lurch. Ben fell against Sheffield, and they both toppled to the ground. The air was filled with a roar. Jesus, God in heaven, cried Ben. It's a quake. Everybody in Port Royal was rooted to the spot, hoping the tremor would quickly pass. When it did not, many of them crept under tables. Those who did not were showered with falling tiles from the roofs. Skulls were cracked and limbs broken. Those who had remained mute began shrieking with confusion or fear, but their cries were drowned out by the mighty rumblings of the earth. Jeremy, his flesh bouncing like jelly, moved as quickly as his thick legs would carry him toward the center of the square, trying to avoid the tumbling tiles and bricks. Tuli came stumbling out of the tavern, her face blank, not comprehending what was happening. She tripped on her own skirts and fell to the floor of the veranda. Just then, the building above her began to crumble. Sticks, mortar, and wooden beams came falling down. She screamed just once, a short final scream, before she was buried by the debris. Only her heavily ringed hand remained visible. Then a great thunder, greater than anything produced by the sky, reverberated throughout Port Royal. Jeremy put his hands over his ears. His eardrums hurt as he listened, and his breath would not come easily. His stiff lips formed the words, "Have mercy," but no sound came from his closed throat. The ground rippled beneath them, throwing him off balance, head first into the flaming pit. His screams of agony were muffled by the hogs falling into the pit on top of him. Trees were downed and fire started to spread. One woman, maddened with terror, gazed for an instant into the flames and fell into them. The grumbling and hissing flames embraced her. A zigzagged opening split the earth, shooting through the center of town. People fell inside, their cries fading softly as they plunged to great depths. Holding up his pants, the lieutenant governor rushed from his home, which also housed the bell tower, after witnessing the sudden death of his mistress. One hand held his pants and the other reached blindly forward, searching for the steps leading away from the shaking building. His eyes were burning and sightless from the falling limestone dust, and stared helplessly about. Then there was a great cracking sound. The tears began to clear from his eyes as he turned and looked up in time to see the entire side of the bell tower falling forward, the great brass bell preceding it. The edge of the great bell struck him just above the waist, neatly severing him in half before he was completely buried by debris. Like ants whose anthill had been kicked, the 2,000 inhabitants of Port Royal fled to the sea, only to discover the wharf and piers sinking into the churning sea. "The ships!" someone cried. "If only we could get to the ships!" People surged against one another, biting, tearing, clawing to reach the small boats that could carry them to the ships anchored in the harbor. The strongest managed to get into the boat, beating off the others with the oars. Someone from the back of the crowd fired a pistol, and several bodies fell, screaming. The two small boys who had been attending the spit wisely hid beneath the gallows. They clutched each other and sobbed, thinking they were somehow at fault. They continued crying and holding on to one another until a giant ebony tree was uprooted and fell across the gallows, silencing them. A white woman, clutching her child to her breast and dodging the falling rubble, was knocked to the ground by a runaway horse. The woman lay bleeding and quiet. The child, old enough to crawl, began wailing and moving away from its mother. The earth opened beneath it, sucking the child into an abyss. Those who had fled into the sea, instead of taking to the mountains for protection, were suddenly faced with inevitable destruction. Large chunks of Port Royal were rapidly disappearing into the swirling sea. Inside the prison walls, the two pirate prisoners cowered beneath their heavy wooden beds. The great walls of the prison began to crumble and fall. Since the prison was built on the mountainside, the wall fell out. At that, all that was left were the wooden beams and tiles of the roof. After they were sure nothing else was going to topple on them, they dug their way out. "Are you all right?" Ben asked. "Are you all right, Ben?" asked Sheffield. "My knees feel like jelly, but yes, I guess I'm in one piece." The door to the prison swung on its hinges. The two men made a dash for it. Just outside the door lay the body of John Crow, bleeding beneath the fallen stones. "Poor son of a bee-leap," muttered Ben. "Don't waste your tears, my lad. He was our jailer." "It wasn't his fault," replied Ben. From where they were, they could see what was left of Port Royal. Aghast, Ben started to run forward toward the square. Sheffield caught him by the scruff of the neck. "Are you mad? It's to the mountains we'll take. It's safer up there. Come, let's see if we can find ourselves a horse." They found no horse, but came upon a frightened mule. Sheffield grabbed his harness and began dragging it through the lush vegetation and up the mountainside. At the edge of the clearing, they passed several ruined homes. The earth was still trembling, causing fallen stones to bounce lightly and fall. Rising above the din, a voice shrill with fright called out, "Flambe! Flambe!" Both pirates turned. The high wind made it difficult to tell where the voice was coming from. "Flambe! It's coming from over there," said Ben, pointing towards a crumbled building. "We have no time," replied Flambe quickly. It was a woman's voice. Captain. "It gets terribly cold at night in the mountains." Sheffield tied the mule to a tree, and together the two men in search of the disembodied voice. "Flambe! Over here, please!" "Look, there she is!" cried Ben excitedly. He was pointing at a section of roof that had fallen and was leaning against an uprooted tree. Trapped beneath the roof, but apparently not seriously harmed, was a woman named Marie Devonshire, a pretty blonde girl of 18 years old who had been deported from a London jail to Port Royal. Born illegitimate, Marie took her name from the part of England where she was born. "It's Marie!" exclaimed Ben. "You know her too?" asked Sheffield, grinning. Who doesn't know Marie Devonshire? Aye, she's the best piece in these parts. Ooh. They approached the young woman, whose dust-covered face was streaked with tears. Flambe! She cried pitifully. Please help me out. I fear I'm trapped. When she saw Ben, she managed a slight smile. Ben, help me. I'm caught. Please help me. I'll finish the rest later.